Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about the problems with long-term macro tracking, how it can create psychological issues, and how it's just simply emotionally unhealthy. And most experts, including even sports nutritionists and other people, tend to agree with this. Right? You only see a tiny subsection of the online fitness community who thinks people should be tracking their macros year round. And you'll notice, incidentally, all of those people are prone to major eating disorders and body image disorders, like the actual people who promote it. So we'll come over to the point with that. Before people say, well, Jason, I'm not taking advice from you, you're fat. Well, if you think I'm fat, you probably have an eating disorder. But the point is, I don't gain body fat when I fail to track macros. The only time I start gaining body fat is when I don't count my calories at all. Does that make sense? Usually that's what happens. If I go 6 weeks without counting calories, I'm going to put on 10 pounds of body weight. Because I just have an absurdly high appetite even when eating fairly clean foods, right? Or with certain things going on in my diet. So I'm not saying not to track calories at all. I mean, for me, that would be disastrous. And I think we all understand that. Because people have seen it. I can gain weight very, very quickly. Very easily without thinking about it. It's nothing to do with slow metabolism. It's because I'll eat 5,000 calories if I don't track. But let's talk about the macro tracking itself. The problem is the level of obsession and the fixation on control that exists. And it's actually very, very false. Meaning people who try to track every single macro, first of all, they don't understand that exact macro counts don't really impact body composition in any significant way. And that's usually something that throws a lot of those people off who become obsessed with it. They really and truly think that how they choose to fill, I don't know, if they're on a 2,500 calorie diet, they're hitting their protein needs after the first couple thousand calories. How they choose to fill the last 500 calories as far as protein, carbs, fat, particularly carbs versus fat, isn't going to make a measurable difference on their body composition. It really isn't. It's not. And so I would say to people, well, maybe you should just decide if you want to run a higher or a lower fat diet, pick foods accordingly, hit a certain protein number, and just hit calories. Right? And honestly, this is how most of my lifters do stuff. I only have a handful of lifters who choose to track macros, and I can tell you right now they make the least progress in anything that they do. Right? My lifters, my clients who obsessively track macros make the worst progress out of anybody I coach as a general rule. My guys who make the best progress don't count anything. And no, they're not necessarily fat. I have guys who some of you would think are fat, and I have guys who you guys would think, oh wow, he's got visible abs, guy's got a six-pack. Deadlifting 550. Doesn't track his food. So just throwing that out there. No, it's not necessary for success. And no one's talking about physique competition before people bring that in. I am not pro physique competition. I don't endorse it. I don't follow it. I'm not a fan of it. And I don't think physique competition is part of a healthy or fit lifestyle. Okay? And therefore, that's not what we're talking about. But I would say that people who are going to do physique competition, you really need a therapist more than a nutritionist. That's why one of the best prep coaches I ever met actually has an advanced degree in psychology. Why do you think that is? Because that's more important than knowing nutrition. You want to know how to get somebody ripped with the nutrition in? Put them in a calorie deficit a long time and jack their protein way up. Any macro counting being done is purely for control purposes by the coach, so that they have the psychological control to take it out of your hands. It's what it's about. It's a control thing. But let's come over to the point of people who think that they need to count their macros all the time. Well, first of all, it doesn't matter. Okay? It is not meaningfully going to impact your body composition in the long term, whether you choose to do a little more fat or carbs with your discretionary calories. Yes, you can get too much fat in your diet and make it slightly easier to gain fat in a surplus. You could have your carbs too low and negatively impact your training. Okay, those things, that is true. But they don't have a massive difference for your remaining calories for the most part. And I generally tell people you probably want to go with either a lower carb or a lower fat approach, depending upon what you're doing, right? Both methods can work. I'm not a fan of mixing large amounts of both together. I find that for anyone with body fat or satiety issues, that's a recipe for disaster. Just been my experience. Right, the people who really have to worry about body fat, that can be problematic. Chronic undereaters, a skinny guy, totally different. They can do whatever they want. They probably don't need to care at all about their macros, other than making sure that they get enough carbs and things to fuel their training, worrying about protein. But the protein is the one that matters. It's protein and then net calories. Protein impacts your net calories itself, though, more than the other because of the thermic effect and other stuff that happens. So that's why it's important to know that your maintenance calories are going to be different on different protein amounts. So that's why you need to track both. Okay, that's why it's a good idea to track both. Plus, we need certain amounts of protein to maintain lean tissue and everything when you're in a deficit. So I understand tracking protein. Makes sense. In my case, I track 200 grams of protein. Doesn't mean that's all I eat. I just only make sure that I get at least 200. I might eat 250. I might eat 300 in a day. But I make sure I get my 200. Right? That's kind of my number I shoot for. And I don't track it beyond that. But the issue, it doesn't matter. It is not meaningfully going to impact your results. It really isn't. And if you think that you're seeing these big changes in the mirror based upon your little bit of ratio of carbs versus fat, you probably have a body image disorder already. It'd be time for you to consider a therapist. Okay? It's not physical, psychological in nature at that point. That's what you're seeing. But over to the other point, the obsession with control. You don't have it. First of all, by trying to count the macros themselves, you're focusing on controlling a variable that isn't particularly important. And I want people to note I didn't say all calories are equal either. Food quality probably matters more than your macro count. To be perfectly honest, the quality of your food probably more important for the long term. Right? Calories matter in the short term the most. Nutrition quality impacts longer term results more because it affects recovery, energy, mood. Well, that stuff's all going to affect your training and how much muscle you gain or lose. A lot. Food quality is probably a bigger issue than exact macros. Sorry, flexible dieters, that is the reality. But the other issue is you can't even track it. Okay, people are obsessing over something that they're ballparking. And you get that. People say, well, I have a digital food scale. I know how many calories or how many grams of carbs I ate. No, you don't. You know you don't. You don't own the equipment to measure that. A digital food scale is going to give you a different reading or estimation of your calories on your dry rice depending upon how much humidity it's absorbed. Okay? In other words, that X number of grams of dry rice could be 600 calories, it could be 650. Okay, it can be off by up to 10% even though the digital scale measured it to 1/10 of a gram. Because moisture in water weighs more than most of the food you're weighing. Right? It actually has a higher density than the food, so that dry measurement you took, the dry measurement out of the actual scooper was probably more accurate than the weight was on a lot of these dry goods. What? Yeah, that's probably more accurate because it removes the moisture component. Okay? Same thing with the meats and stuff you're weighing out. Well, you don't know the exact moisture content. If you take your meat and you put it in the fridge, probably for every half day it sits in the fridge, the caloric value of that meat probably increases slightly, I don't know, every 12 hours. Probably enough to be significant at the exact same weight because it loses moisture and therefore loses density. But the moisture that is leaving has no caloric value, but it impacts the weight. Okay? So due to a lot of these variables and factors, your digital scale cannot accurately measure your calories. It gives you a ballpark. It'll get you within 5 to 10%. In other words, if you have perfectly digitally scaled out everything, the 3,000 calories exactly that you measured is probably somewhere between 28 and 3,200 that you perfectly measured out. It might even be up to 3,300 or as low as 2,700 in some extreme cases. Okay, you can't accurately measure this. And what ends up happening is that the people who obsess over these things that, number one, don't matter that much. Number two, it's a fake sense of control. What you're doing is you're obsessing over the control. You're obsessing over the control of something that you can't fully control accurately anyways. And in the long term, it just leads to disordered eating. It leads to eating disorders, everything else. And most experts will tell you macro tracking is not a viable long-term strategy. It's not psychologically healthy. All right, guys, so that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.